You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on June the 11th, 2025 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, broadcasting to you live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Georgina Godwin. Coming up on today's programme.
First, we had to get sort of the negativity out, and now we can go forward to try to do positive trade, growing trade, and beneficial to both China and to the United States of America.
The US and China have reached a broad framework agreement on trade. We'll hear more about the deal. Donald Tusk faces a confidence vote in Poland today. We'll cross to Warsaw for the details. We'll join our Paris bureau chief to examine the strained relationship between France and Israel. And we'll be in Kuala Lumpur for a readout on the crackdown on literature there. And then,
for us living in uranium areas, that people naturally equate uranium with death and destruction and, bad stuff.
We'll hear more about the uranium mining industry in Utah. All that right here on The Briefing with me, Georgina Godwin. The US and China have struck what they're calling a framework to keep their trade truce intact after high-stakes talks in London aimed at cooling tensions. Well, Patricia Thornton, a professor in politics of China at the University of Oxford, joins me on the line now. Patricia, what do we know about this agreement?
Yes, good afternoon. At this point, we don't know all that much. What we do know is that some sort of tentative, what they're calling a framework, was agreed, but that any more final sort of conclusion of this round of negotiations will await the sign-off of both Donald Trump and Xi Jinping.
Now, rare earth minerals, we understand, are vitally important to this. Can you tell us about the significance of them?
Yes, well, China has developed a near monopoly on the processing of rare earth minerals since the early 2000s, and the U.S. is very dependent, as are many other countries, of course, on rare earths for the production of so many different kinds of goods. China had allegedly agreed at the Geneva talks, which occurred in May, that they would lift export controls on rare earths. But Donald Trump at the end of May then accused Xi Jinping and China on his Truth social media platform of not abiding by that agreement. And China then fired back. So what we saw leading up to this latest round of negotiations was a serious dispute about the alleged withholding on the Chinese side of rare earth minerals. And that is what brought everyone to London for the trade talks.
I understand another central plank of this is US restrictions on chip design software sales to China.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So in retaliation for what was perceived to be Donald Trump then firing back at Xi Jinping, Xi Jinping and the Chinese media accused the US of increasing or not releasing various forms of high-tech chips that China needs in order to continue its own development. And then, of course, on top of all of that, Trump then added these threats to either cancel the visas of Chinese students in the United States or to greatly restrict those visas, something about which the Chinese were very unhappy indeed.
So what does this potential agreement mean for both China and the US?
Well, it's not exactly clear. So the markets have reacted in a rather lukewarm way to this agreement, probably because it's a tentative agreement and probably because we've been caught in this cycle of escalating threats and then de-escalation, but with no firm resolution. Both sides have accused each other of making agreements, but then backing out on those agreements later and not withholding the terms to which were agreed. So it looks as though at least business communities have been somewhat muted in their response to this. tentatively, I mean, if the agreements do hold, this would mean an awful lot to both the United States, to China, as well as to the global economy. The World Bank has just released information stating that by 2027, global growth will have averaged only 2.5% in the 2020s, which is the lowest rate of growth since the 1960s. So we're looking at a global slowdown, economic slowdown, largely triggered by these U.S.-China trade wars. So if this latest agreement brought some resolution to that, clearly, I think global trade would begin to recover. So I think the world is actually holding its breath and waiting to see what happens next.
What might derail it?
First of all, there are a few things. There's Donald Trump's leadership style. He's been, I think, widely perceived as someone who sort of shoots from the hip. One of the reasons why Xi Jinping has not yet met with him personally and would not have gone to Washington, D.C. was because of what was witnessed between Trump's meeting with Zelensky in the Oval Office, as well as Trump's more recent meeting with the president of South Africa. That did not go as planned. Xi Jinping could not be seen to risk his reputation and his own legitimacy on having another sort of big meltdown in the Oval Office with Donald Trump. And then on Xi Jinping's side, of course, China as a rising power is becoming increasingly assertive, if not aggressive, in the South China Sea regarding its islands and its control over Taiwan. So if something should shift in that direction, and there are some early signs that there might be new activity going on there, that's quite worrying, then that could obviously result in a dialing back of this latest tentative framework.
And finally, Patricia, I wonder what the significance of the talks being held at Lancaster House in London is. Does the UK stand to benefit in the tariff wars by playing host?
One would hope so, although there have been some, as of yet, unconfirmed accusations that some conservative minister may have promised to or promised the Chinese negotiators that they would have access to the Royal Mint site, where China hopes to build a new super embassy. So, but that's as of yet unconfirmed. Hopefully, the UK will indeed secure some sort of special status in the negotiations, both from the US as well as with China.
Patricia, thank you very much indeed. That's Patricia Thornton there, Professor in the Politics of China at the University of Oxford. Now, here's Monica Lillis with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Georgina. 31 people have been killed and around 200 wounded when Israeli troops fired on people waiting to enter a food distribution centre, according to the Gaza Civil Defence Agency. Thousands of Palestinians had been gathering since the early hours in the hope of reaching the US and Israeli-backed aid point. South Korea has halted loudspeaker broadcasts of anti-North Korean propaganda along the border shared by the two countries. The speakers had previously been paused for 6 years but resumed in June last year in response to North Korea's campaign of sending rubbish-filled balloons across the border. The latest move is seen as a step towards fulfilling President Lee Jae-myung's vow to rebuild trust with Pyongyang. And the low-cost Vietnamese airline Vietjet Aviation JSC is in talks to order around 100 additional Airbus SE narrowbody jets in a deal that could be announced as early as next week. The airline is said to be looking to buy more of the A321neo model, the highest capacity single-aisle jet that Airbus makes. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Georgina.
Thank you, Monica. Poland's Prime Minister Donald Tusk faces a confidence vote today, called by Tusk himself after his ally lost the presidential election to Conservative Karol Nawrocki. While the presidency is a separate power, Nawrocki's veto could block Tusk's pro-EU agenda, setting the stage for serious gridlock. Well, Mateusz Mazzini, who's a writer-at-large at Gazeta Wyborcza and lecturer in journalism at Collegium Civitas in Warsaw, joins me now. Mateusz, good to speak to you again. Why did Tusk call this vote now? What's he hoping to prove?
Well, from a practical standpoint, this is fundamental to prove to the nation as well as to the ruling coalition that he still commands a substantial majority in the parliament. According to the framework of governance provided by the Polish constitution, it is still the prime minister with his cabinet that commands more or executes more power. The competences and prerogatives of the president are largely ceremonial, though he does have a very powerful negative competence with the veto that you mentioned yourself. He's able to veto pretty much every bill coming out of the parliament, and Tusk's coalition doesn't have a majority that would be large enough to repeal the veto, hence the possibility of gridlock. But from a symbolic standpoint, especially given the fact that this is a very heterogeneous coalition that includes a number of different smaller and bigger parties, including the traditionally socially conservative Peasants' Party and the left, more urban-centered formations that represent or claim to represent the interests of the entrepreneurs and the middle class, and they were struggling massively for the last year and a half to agree on the most important proposals, including things like same-sex marriage, abortion law, and Tusk, I guess, is trying to energize his own troops by sending through a message that he is still, in fact, in charge.
And what is the expected outcome of the vote?
Well, mathematically speaking, he should be safe to survive as prime minister with his government, because, as I said before, there should be enough votes for him to survive that vote, especially given the fact that most of the opposition MPs, including almost every MP of Law and Justice, the former governing party of Poland, did not take part in listening to Prime Minister's expose this morning. They vacated their seats. They gathered for a press conference outside of the building of Parliament. They're obviously not going to vote in favor of this government remaining in power, but there are a few shaky elements of this coalition. We know from some of the behind-the-scenes conversations that a number of the more conservative MPs from the rural party, especially those representing farmers and the more conservative small-town electorate, have been tempted by Law and Justice to perhaps vote against Tusk's own government and form some sort of a technical cabinet, which the details of which were never actually revealed. But this is still, for now, very unlikely that Tusk's cabinet is going to fall.
And do you think that the election of Nawrocki signals a deeper shift in Poland's political direction?
Oh, absolutely. I think we're at the beginning of the end of the old political partisan order here in Poland. That has been pretty much centered for the last 20 to 25 years on the personal rivalry between Tusk himself and Jarosław Kaczyński, the chairman of Law and Justice, who himself was prime minister some 20 years ago. I think they're both coming to an end in terms of them being the protagonists of the Polish political scene. I think we're going to see further rise of the far right, the Confederation Party, that is a mixture of right-wing nationalism and libertarian economic policies. I think more radical parties on the left side of the spectrum will also gather more support and strength. And the politics of Poland as we knew it is pretty much evaporating right in front of our eyes.
Could this tension spill over into Poland's foreign policy? I mean, particularly on Ukraine and the EU?
I think this is one of the most fundamental questions of Nawrocki's term as president. I think we all need to be aware, and this is fundamentally important for international audience, that Nawrocki is much more anti-Ukrainian than Andrzej Duda, the outgoing president, ever was. In fact, Duda, despite the fact that he was unpopular with government supporters because he was a Law and Justice candidate, is still somehow perceived as a kind of a hero in Ukraine because of his very open pro-Ukrainian stance, especially in the first years after the full-scale invasion. Nawrocki will be nowhere near that foreign policy position. He will be very critical of Ukraine. He's quite unlikely to declare any support for Kiev unconditionally. And one of the most destabilizing lines of potential crisis going forward could be a dispute over foreign policy competences, because it is almost exclusively a competence of the government, ergo the foreign minister Radosław Sikorski. But because Sikorski and Nawrocki will differ significantly on what to do with Ukraine, but also what to do with the United States, Nawrocki was heavily backed by Donald Trump himself. I guess we're we're about to experience a major policy dispute that will not end well for Poland.
Mateusz, thank you very much indeed. That's Mateusz Mazzini, writer-at-large at Gazeta Wyborcza and lecturer in journalism at Collegium Civitas in Warsaw. You're back with the briefing on Monocle Radio. France says it's secured key reform pledges from the Palestinian Authority ahead of next week's statehood conference in New York. President Macron says recognition is still on the table, but only if the Palestinians deliver. Meanwhile, the Franco-Palestinian MEP Rima Hassan, who was picked up by Israeli forces for her participation in the so-called Freedom Flotilla, is still in detention in Tel Aviv, having refused to sign deportation papers. Well, I'm joined now by Simon Bouvier, who is Monocle's Paris bureau chief. Simon, good to have you back on the show. How's Paris today?
Bonjour, Georgina. It is sunny here, so we're happy about it. The summer has officially arrived.
Fantastic. Let's start with Rima Hassan. Has she had her deportation hearing, and what happens to her now?
Well, not yet, Georgina. And the story is that essentially the Israeli Navy boarded this Freedom Flotilla vessel off the coast of Israel. Now, there's a debate on whether it was in international waters or in Israeli waters. Many experts say it's likely that it was still in international waters. And the authorities asked the activists who were on board to sign papers recognizing that they were illegally entering Israeli waters and that they agreed to be deported. And Rima Hassan is one of the people who refused to sign these documents, presumably because they would have been an admission of entering Israeli waters, which she does not recognize that they have.
And so, I mean, I understand, for instance, Greta Thunberg did sign. She's now been put on a flight back to Sweden. So Rima and I think the 8 other people or 7 other people are still being held there. Is this a big story in France?
It is, because 6 of the 12 activists who were originally on the boat were French, and there are still 4 French citizens in detention. And so we've seen the back and forth between President Macron, the Foreign Minister Jean-Noël Barrot, and the Israeli authorities, which has been quite I shall say civil and professional compared to the tenor of the public kind of barbs that Israel and France have been throwing at one another in the papers recently. But so we're still waiting for all 4 of these French citizens to appear in front of an Israeli judge who will determine whether they should be deported or if they have a right to stay in Israel and plead their case in front of an Israeli tribunal, which, you know, we can only speculate. But I think since the point of this trip for a number of them, including Hassan, was to bring attention to the what they have called the kind of blockade, the humanitarian blockade of Gaza, she would much prefer if there was a trial in the public eye where she could say her piece.
Let's look at the broader picture. These reforms that France says it's secured from Mahmoud Abbas. Do we know much more about that?
Well, essentially, as you mentioned earlier, Georgina, there's this conference on the two-state solution being held at the UN next week, which is being co-chaired by France and Saudi Arabia. And I think France has been for decades saying that they think that a two-state solution is the way out of this, but it's been withholding recognition for a Palestinian state because they were hoping that a political solution could be agreed to between Israel and the Palestinian Authority before they did that. But since that prospect is seeming increasingly unlikely in the current climate, I think that there's a real sense that in Paris and in other European capitals, by the way, there is no reasoning with the current Israeli government, and so the time might be right to make a move.
Is this a real shift in French policy, or is it more about positioning Paris as a credible broker?
I think it's a bit of both, Georgina. It's definitely Macron positioning himself as the president of Europe, as you will, as he has done in Ukraine, for instance, which tends to annoy his European counterparts. I know the Giorgia Meloni calls them macronate or macronades. His kind of tendency to do these kind of grandiloquent posturing on the international stage without much impact on the reality on the ground. I think, to me, this is a significant departure from this kind of Western orthodoxy that we've been discussing, of saying on the one hand that you support a two-state solution, but then doing nothing to make that happen until and unless there is some sort of political agreement that is settled over there. I think now there's a real sense that they're fed up with the behavior of the Israeli government under Prime Minister Netanyahu, and they think, probably now is the time to move.
And Simon, what should we expect then from this conference next week? Do you think any concrete outcomes or just more diplomatic choreography?
Well, there are conflicting reports on whether or not France and indeed the UK might announce their official recognition of a Palestinian state as a result of this conference. Now, of course, the idea of signaling, since in France's case, since April, that they intend to use this conference as a forum to make this announcement is a way to negotiate with both parties and try to extract concessions from them on the Israeli side to scale back the violence and allow humanitarian aid into Gaza, and on the Palestinian Authority side to extract concessions from them and make sure that they create the conditions that would make a Palestinian state that the European Union thinks it can live with, and that means no Hamas, demilitarization of the organization, plus exclusion from any future governance structure. And the president of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, recently, I think it was yesterday, wrote a letter to President Macron saying that he supported the demilitarization of Hamas and their exclusion from any future governing or ruling body. But I think his credibility, Abbas's, is also a big problem here. What does it mean that he wrote this letter? Time will tell how significant it is, but he has a serious deficit in credibility because he has no power over Hamas.
Simon, many thanks. I can just picture you now strolling out of our lovely studio there through the cafe and along the gorgeous Rue Bachemont in the Paris sunshine. How lovely for you. That was Simon Bouvier, our Monocle Paris Bureau Chief. This is The Briefing on Monocle Radio. In Malaysia, while book fairs are drawing record crowds and reading culture is booming, the government has banned more publications in the first 5 months of 2025 than in the previous 2 years combined. Romance novels are being pulled from shelves, authors are facing restrictions, and critics are calling it political theatre. I'm joined now by Hadi Azmi, Kuala Lumpur-based journalist. Hadi, it's lovely to have you on the programme. I know we've been trying to get you on for a long time. Can you tell us, why is book censorship conducted in Malaysia at all? Can you explain the background?
Hi, Georgina. Malaysia has long been censoring books. Actually, it's a relic from the colonial era, and it has been a pivotal tool in the fight against communism back in the 1950s. But it never went away. There was a time even as late as the 1980s, the government have people with markers literally blacking out paragraph from magazines, from international magazines, where they publish articles that the government doesn't agree with. So it has been a tool for censorship for the government for quite a long time. But the scary thing is the fact that it has been resurging lately under the Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim, which is a lot of people are concerning about.
What are the common characteristics of the 12 books that have been banned so far this year?
Yeah, so normally Malaysia ban Islamic books that veer off from the government's very narrow definition of orthodoxy. I went through the blacklist, and there were even translations of the Quran that the government are not happy with that are included in the blacklist. Most of the time, the books that are banned are also books on the topic of LGBTQ, which is very much a taboo in Malaysia. But the thing with this latest list, with the 12 books banned this year, it suddenly includes romantic novels from well-regarded writers that is in the New York Times bestseller list. So I went through the books. I was looking for, what could, offend the government, and I couldn't find anything actually. So yeah, the arbitrariness of this ban is quite baffling actually.
And there's reportedly a reading boom happening at the same time. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, I mean, there was a recent Kuala Lumpur book fest. We got a record attendance of 2.1 million people over a span of a week. It was very popular. Half of the city was jammed because of it. Hotels were full. And a lot of bookstores are doing very well. We got a lot of big bookstores from Taiwan, from Japan are opening up outlets here. So it's quite a contradiction, the amount of booming in reading and the censorship. No, on weekends, Malaysians normally would just go to a bookstore and just hang out there, pick up a book, hang out at the cafe, spend time there. So yeah.
Has there been any pushback against this censorship?
Well, yeah, there have been. I mean, people are complaining about it. It's been something that a lot of Malaysians complain about, but there's very little that we could do because the law that governs book banning basically gives the Home Minister a blank check of what kind of books he can ban, and based on whatever discretion that he decides. So there's no clear guideline, and there's also no clear way out for authors that have been banned on how to being removed from the list. It's like once you're in, you're not going to go out.
Hadi, thank you very much indeed. That was Hadi Azmi, a Kuala Lumpur-based journalist, and you're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. US President Donald Trump wants to boost American energy production. From Drill Baby Drill to his Day One executive order titled Unleashing American Energy, the Trump administration is trying to eliminate red tape and regulations to accelerate projects. Last month, the US Interior Department fast-tracked an approval for a new uranium mining project in Utah. Monocle's Washington correspondent H.J. Mai travelled to Arizona and Utah to examine the current state of uranium mining and whether a new mining boom could be imminent.
Down into the mine.
There's a rush of cold air and water dripping down the rocks as the mine elevator takes us down a dark shaft to a depth of about 1,500 feet. After roughly 6 minutes, the elevator stops and the doors open. And the quiet darkness of the mine shaft is replaced by the sounds of heavy machinery and diesel fumes.
Last summer, we started getting into ore production and negotiations with the tribes and state of Arizona, and then we fully restarted ore hauling to the White Mesa Mill February 12th.
That's Mine Superintendent Matt Germanson. He's been with Energy Fuels, the owner and operator of the mine, for over 10 years. The Pinyon Plain mine is located on federal land, less than 10 miles from the Grand Canyon.
The whole Southwest is kind of the heartbeat of the uranium industry for generations. You can see it's just a gray rock. The gray is, some of it's from copper, some of it's from uranium. It's a multi-metal deposit. And this pile on average is around 1% uranium. That means 99% of that material in that rock is essentially inert. It's not uranium.
While 1% sounds like nothing, Germanson says it's the highest grade uranium deposit in the whole country. The start of production at Pinyon Plain is one indication for the recent increase in uranium mining in the US. Last year, the industry recorded a 6-year high. Yet US nuclear power plants still import over 99% of the uranium used to generate energy. Energy Fuels CEO Mark Chalmers who over his almost 50 years in the industry has been through several boom and bust cycles, says things appear a little different this time around.
Around the world, you're seeing more bipartisan support for nuclear for all the right reasons.
But Chalmers acknowledges that despite all the administration's efforts, running a mining company in the US remains challenging.
Getting projects approved in the United States is more challenging than certain jurisdictions. Just time to get the permits. The United States is very litigious, so there can be lawsuits that can try to stop you or injunct you from going forward.
And it's not just the regulatory hurdles. The history of mining in the United States is littered with safety violations, environmental disasters, and worker exploitation. And it's no different when it comes to uranium mining. Because of that, there's pushback from environmental organizations and activists like Leona Morgan.
More energy means more extraction, more processing, and then more waste. So for us, that means additional cleanup and cancer risks and exposure on top of all the old stuff.
Morgan is a member of the Navajo Nation, whose territory includes areas with rich uranium deposits. She has been a leading voice on the harmful impacts of uranium mining. During the peak of American uranium mining, from the late 40s to the early 80s, more than 1,000 small mines were located on Navajo land. Over 500 of them were left abandoned. Many of these mines have contaminated drinking sources, and many native miners suffered health issues.
For us living in uranium areas that people naturally equate uranium with death and destruction and, bad stuff.
Given that history, there's resistance among many Native American tribes. But companies like Energy Fuels say safety is their top priority. And regulators have confirmed radiation levels and water quality are within federal guidelines. But that's not good enough for those who have seen the impact of the past.
If they're trying to mine uranium, these are places most likely they were already mined before. So the people are already suffering the legacy, they're already suffering past contamination, and now it's new contamination. And you're not going to convince anyone.
Whether uranium can be mined safely without risk for human health or the environment is dependent on several factors, says lawyer and scientist Paul Locke of Johns Hopkins University.
It's not that it can't be done, it's just that there's a history there and there's a community that needs, the community is the one that needs to be convinced.
Locke served as an expert in 2 cases involving uranium mining projects. He says the biggest risk for the environment and nearby communities comes after the mining itself has ceased.
All you have left is the surface impoundment with the waste. Okay, so I reviewed hundreds of reports about facilities like these. They all leaked, all of them, okay? So this is a weakness.
It's possible to minimize those risks, but that takes time, commitment, and money. Nevertheless, the Trump administration is pushing ahead with plans to boost domestic mining, as the competition with China and others over critical minerals and rare earths continue. Back at Pinyon Plain Mine, 5 truckloads of uranium ore are now leaving every day on their way to a processing facility in southern Utah.
So that's the sound of 2.5 tons of uranium ore being drilled, blasted, moved from the heading to the loading pocket, from the loading pocket to surface, and now we finally see it reach surface, get carried over to the ore pad, and then the ore trucks show up and take it to the mill finally.
This kind of uranium mining is very much included in the Trump administration's plans. For Monocle in Flagstaff, Arizona, I'm H.J. Mai.
That was Monocle's Washington correspondent H.J. Mai. And that's all for this edition of The Briefing, which was produced by Hassan Anderson. Our researcher was Francesca Gilks and our studio manager was Steph Chungu. The Briefing is back tomorrow at the same time. I'm Georgina Godwin. Goodbye and thanks for listening.